Hello, everyone. I'm Michael DiMuccio for Medi-Share, and with us today in the interview is Sarah Mackenzie. She is the founder of readaloudrevival.com, and she is a two-time USA Today best-selling author. So, Sarah, welcome to the interview.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
It's good having you. And as we begin the interview today, it's funny, ironically, you and I were at a common conference in Fort Worth, Texas, about a month and a half ago. And that conference with the Great Homeschool Convention, they were ordered by the city to close things down because of the coronavirus. What have you been up to since then?
So many things. There's a first time for everything. Never have I been at a conference that's been, closed down for a pandemic before. So there was that. But coming home, we have 6 kids. My husband and I have 6 kids who we homeschool, from 6-year-old twins all the way up to our 18-year-old. And so I came home to just keep homeschooling and keep things going at Read Aloud Revival. And, it's a strange time. So I think a lot of us are just feels like we're expending a lot of energy to just keep the morale up and keep things chugging forward.
Yeah, I could imagine. Same with us coming back from that. There was a lot of changes, obviously. And so, your experience is so valued by people, across the country when it comes to really equipping their children with reading. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? How did you get into that? How did that become such a passion in your life?
Yeah, well, I read aloud to all my kids, from the time they were very small, but it wasn't until I heard a talk by Andrew Pudewa. He's from the Institute for Excellence in Writing. He gave this talk on nurturing competent communicators. And basically the premise of the talk is that the 2 best things you can do to help your child be a good communicator, whether that's spoken or written, is to recite poetry and then to read aloud a ton. And so I was really motivated after hearing that talk to read aloud even more to my kids than I had been before. And what happened are all the things he promised would happen, things like improved comprehension, better reading skills, and appreciation for stories. But there were these other things that were happening that I didn't anticipate. Things like the connection and relationships that were being formed between the siblings and between me and my kids, kind of the inside jokes, sort of like when you're a family and you go to a movie together and then people start quoting the movie later and everyone starts laughing. We were having those kinds of experiences over and over about the books we were reading. And my kids' love for reading just went through the roof. And so I think a lot of us parents have this similar experience of when we realize how powerful reading aloud can be, and how simple it is as well. Those 2 things make us a little bit crazy about it. We're so excited about it. So I ended up starting a podcast just to talk about the influence that reading aloud had on my own kids', our own family relationships, our own homeschool, and that podcast, which I thought was just going to be a couple of episodes, ended up really sort of taking on a life of its own. And so now it's been downloaded almost 7 million times all around the world. And it's been sort of, I think so many of us have this similar experience, right? Of realizing that reading a book with our kids doesn't just help them in all these academic and social and emotional ways, but it's really delightful. It can be really delightful. And so we end up becoming really zealous about it.
Well, it's certainly proved to be a great strength that developed in your life and you're touching lives. It's funny. I personally was not a reader growing up. And right now in my life, I'm not a parent. And so I think of this whole concept and I start with what do you do with the kid that just doesn't like to read? How do you overcome that?
I think a lot of us face this sort of dread almost, oh, I really wanted you to love reading. And I think that's not happening. I think you don't love it. I think you might not even like it. There's a really common thing that happens. Jim Trelease talks about it in his book, The Read Aloud Handbook, where he talks about schooling the love of reading out of our kids. Basically, if you took any 4 or 5-year-old, 3, 4, 5-year-old, they love being read to. If I was to sit in the middle of a park and open a picture book, then kids would be naturally, and start reading it aloud, kids would naturally start coming to me to listen. We're just naturally attracted to stories. It's the way God made us, right? To love story. And yet, by the time they're third grade, fourth grade, sixth grade, definitely high school, for most kids, that love of stories has been replaced by a sense of obligation. You know, this feeling of I have to read now for school. So I think two big things are happening. One is that we are actually schooling the love of reading out of our kids. Number two, we're maybe not helping them find the right books. A lot of books are they're just boring. And so when we try to convince our kids or say to our kids that reading is good for them, you know, that's not really that inspiring. It's kind of like equating it to eating your vegetables at dinner, right? And so I think the first thing we need to do is sort of pull back, realize that everybody loves stories. Pretty much everybody loves movies, right? Sports, conversations. If you go to the store and you come home and you tell your family all about what happened there, you're telling a story. We just are constantly telling stories and looking for stories. I love to make this connection between even adults want a bedtime story. It's why so many of us turn the TV on at night before we go to bed, right? To turn something on. We want to be told stories. If we can pull back and realize that that is a very human desire and need, how can we help our kids find the kind of stories that light them up and help them realize they're just enjoyable for enjoyment's sake, not necessarily because they're going to make you a better scholar or make you a better student or improve your character, because those aren't really compelling reasons to read.
True. Now, that's a good point. I think of, if I were raising a child right now, or, in those years where we're at that point, what would be a good starting point or a good method in reading aloud to your child?
One really good way in is simply to remember which books you loved when you were a kid and read those. I think a lot of us get hung up on making sure we have the right books. We think there's like a book list with like the classics or something. We're pretty sure our kids should love those. And so we put this really high bar up for the kind of books we want our kids to like and enjoy, and that we think we should read to them. And that should is a big hiccup there, because if we were just to read a book that we really loved as a kid, then the delight that we feel in revisiting it will probably leak over to our kids and influence them as well. The other thing that I think is really helpful, besides just thinking back to your own favorites as a child, is to get a reputable or reliable book list of the best books to read aloud. Not all books read aloud equally well. And if you read aloud a few duds, you're just going to feel like this isn't working for them. They don't like it. I don't like it. So one thing we've done at Read Aloud Revival, this is fairly new, is we've created a quiz that's just 3 questions. So it's free. You just go on to the website and you plug in your kids' ages and then the kind of story you're in the mood for, whether it's magic or history or a classic or something funny. And then how much time you've got. Are you looking for a long book or are you looking for a quick win? And then we spit out 2 of our favorite book recommendations. And so we have picked the best of the best that we've found and put them into that quiz. So that's free at readaloudrevival.com/quiz. And that's a really great way to find just what your next read aloud could be.
Wow, that is a very useful tool, I would imagine. Now, when I think of this method of reading aloud to your children, what are the benefits? Like, how's that different from giving a child a book, encouraging them to read, let's say? What's the benefit of this concept of reading aloud to them?
Okay, I'm so glad you asked that. This is my favorite thing to talk about. Okay, so there's a few. There's 4 that come to mind right away. They're the kind of the big ones. One is simply academic. So we have a lot of research that shows that getting grammatically correct and sophisticated language in through the ear makes a huge impact on a child's ability to speak and write well. And this makes sense when we think about when you're reading an article in the paper or you're reading a book, you're probably reading it pretty fast. If you're reading it quietly to yourself, just reading it off the page with your eyes. Because the better readers we become and the longer we're reading, the more likely it is that we're skipping all of those little connection words, like all the articles and the modifiers. We're just fast readers, skip words. And so what happens is we store those language patterns into our brain differently than we would if someone was reading aloud every word in order with the proper inflection, the way it is meant to be read, right? And so that language pattern, which is sophisticated and grammatically correct, can get stored into our brain in the proper way when it's heard through the ear. And this is true all the way through life. So it's a benefit even for your kids who read really, really well on their own. There's a distinct benefit to hearing those books read aloud. So there's the academic benefits. We also know that the number one activity you can do to help your child become a good reader is to read aloud to them. There's so much research that backs that up. And it's so much easier than, there's some really compelling research showing that more than, private tutoring, private schools, reading aloud, which is free and takes 15 minutes with a book off your shelf. It's pretty powerful. That's the academic benefit. Another really big benefit, and this one's really compelling to me as a mother, is that there are some recent studies that show that kids who are read a lot of stories or who read a lot of stories growing up, they grow up to be more kind, empathetic, compassionate people. Now, this makes sense if we think through the idea that every time you read a story, you're encountering a character who is overcoming some kind of an obstacle, right? And through the story, you're slipping into that character's shoes and walking a mile in those shoes. So when our kids are small, or kids are in our home, it doesn't have to be when they're small, when our children are at home, if they're getting practice walking a mile in the shoes of hundreds or thousands of characters, they're going to grow up to be able to see things from multiple points of view, to have more compassion, to be able to see what life looks like from someone else's view than their own, which is really important. Then, of course, there's the connection that we feel sharing a story together. I've really noticed this, especially as my older kids have become teens, that sometimes when we're like coming at each other, reading a story puts us on the same side of the bench, basically. It's like it reminds us that we're on the same team, because now we're cheering for the same characters, right? We're worried about the same villains. We're crying in the same moment, or holding our breath, or, we can't wait to get to see what's going to happen. And we're rooting for the same people. We just remember that we're on the same team, which is not always easy to remember when you're home all the time with your teenagers. The final benefit, I think, is pleasure. One of the things we need to remember as adults who are taking care of these children and launching them into the world is that they're actually hopefully going to do most of the reading they do in their whole life after they leave home. If they leave our home, let's say when they're 18 or 20, they're only about 20, God willing, they're only about 25% into their life maybe, right? That means that 75% of the reading they do in their life should happen after they're gone from our home. And so I think a lot of us feel pressure to get all the right books in, to make sure that our kids are reading all the right things before they leave home, when really we would do better to focus on helping our kids love reading. And so that way, when they launch into their adult life, they are readers and are continuing to read. Reading aloud is a really great way to just enjoy reading and help your kids learn that stories are wonderful. They don't need to just be something you check off your list for school, for homework, or to learn something specific, but just to delight in. So all those four things, I can't think of another activity that's free, that takes, 15 minutes or something, that would give you all those benefits to such a great degree. So it's a really powerful, it's powerful, and it's very deceiving in its simplicity, because we think it can't count that much, but it really does.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And very good there. But, you said something about no matter the amount of kids, we're all rooting for the same type of person, and we all know who the villain is. But now when I think of lots of kids here, I think of that kid that just really rambunctious, and you can't, as a parent, get your kid to sit still when they're reading alone, or the reading aloud dynamic. How do you offer parents help in that area when it comes to just getting your kid to sit still?
Yes, I had some of those. Okay, so a really good thing to remember is that your kids don't listen better when they're sitting still. In fact, for many, many children, they actually listen better when they're doing something with their bodies. What happens if they're doing something with their bodies is it frees their mind up to then pay attention to the words that they're hearing. So if you have kids who can't sit still while you're reading aloud, or just don't want to sit still, try giving them something they can do that doesn't take brain work so much as it just keeps their bodies busy. Ideas like coloring or drawing, Legos. I'll let my kids do Lego when we're reading aloud. I'll this is a mom tip for you. Dump that bucket of Legos over first, because it will make you crazy when they rifle their hands through the Legos and make that noise. All the moms listening to this know exactly what I mean. Play-Doh, clay, watercolors, anything where they can just sort of do something with their hands will free up their mind to be able to listen. And so my kids almost always are doing something. A puzzle, that's something we've been doing a lot lately with audiobooks, is doing puzzles. And it's really enjoyable. You might be surprised at how long they can sit there if their bodies are kept busy. And that's true really for, your 4-year-olds and also for your 14-year-olds.
Now, I'm getting this picture in my mind, all the kids are doing, say, a puzzle together, you're reading aloud, that kind of thing. But, now that kind of begs the question in my mind is, how do you choose or select, say, material or reading a particular book to kind of hit on all the different age ranges?
Oh, yes. That's a great question. So my kids are between the ages of 6 and 18, right? So there's this big wide age range. And I have there's 3 teenagers and then 3 younger ones. So we sort of read to them in batches. I'll pick a book that I think is best for the teenagers and read to them and pick a book for the younger kids. However, even my teenagers, there's a pretty big age span, right? So they're 18, 16, and 14. So how do you choose something the 14 and 18-year-old are both interested in? I've always kind of used an idea of shooting toward the middle, because a really good read aloud can appeal to all different ages. C.S. Lewis has this great quote. I don't have it memorized. I'd probably botch it if I tried to remember exactly what it was. But paraphrasing it is that a really good book will appeal to somebody no matter what their age, equally to the child and to the adult. And actually, C.S. Lewis's book is a great example. So think of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which will appeal to a 6-year-old and also to a 66-year-old, right? And so I think if you have a book that's really can appeal to a wide range of ages, then you can read a book that is above or below someone who's listening their own reading level, and they'll still be able to get something wonderful from it. It's a little bit like setting a feast on a table, and everybody kind of gets what they're fit for, or what for themselves. My 18-year-old probably hears The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe a little differently than my 6-year-olds do. But they're both getting their own experience with the book in their own unique way. And the books that we have in that recommendation, the quiz recommendations that I mentioned earlier, most of those are geared toward a pretty wide range of ages as well.
Very good. Very good. Now, again, kind of getting this word mental picture in my mind of you with all your kids kind of thing, or, some of the homeschoolers, they've got big families as well. You're kind of pulling all the kids together, you're reading aloud, do you do that often? Is that like a nightly thing? Or do you have say tips on, frequency or regularity of reading aloud?
Yeah, one thing I like to remember is that even if you were only to read aloud 10 minutes every other day, that still ends up being about 30 hours over the course of a year, which is quite a lot of reading aloud. Because I think sometimes we think, I've got to do this. Now I'm going to do this every day. We're going to read aloud for an hour every day. And if you're anything like me, that's what you do. And then it fizzles out after about the 3rd day when the kids are kicking each other and making noise and you're tired. The other thing is a lot of us equate read aloud time with bedtime, which if that works for you, don't change it. That's amazing and great. But for a lot of families, especially if you've been homeschooling all day, by the time it's bedtime, I am ready for everybody to just be done. And I'm not really alert enough to stay awake very long when I'm reading aloud. So a couple tips can help. One, don't make yourself do it every day. Even if you only read aloud, say half the time, you're still getting a lot of reading in. That will still be a memory your children will remember. When my mom or when my dad read to me growing up, that will still be a very formative part of their childhood. So don't get hung up on doing it every day. Do it earlier in the day. If you find yourself getting really tired, like I do, I will try to read aloud closer to breakfast than dinner. And then if I have the energy, I'll do it at bedtime too. But a lot of times I'll do the read alouds earlier in the day and then have the kids look at books on their own right before bedtime. And then one more tip that's really helpful is if you are trying to get in the habit of reading aloud, pegging it to something else that's happening every day is really helpful. So for example, your kids probably eat breakfast every day. And so do mine. So if I can read aloud for a few minutes while they're eating breakfast, that can become a habit that's just tagged onto something we're already doing. And that's got 2 benefits. One, in that it will remind us to do it, right? Because we're eating breakfast. Oh, that's right. It's time to read aloud. And the other is simply that it's keeps everybody quiet while you're reading aloud, which can be really helpful too. Unless, I will say, you have a toddler and then you're thinking, meal times are not quiet at my house. And I agree. So ignore that advice for a couple more years.
Nice, nice. Now, what about, here you are, you're doing it, say, in the morning over breakfast, and you're giving those doses. But for the parent that maybe struggles with not just controlling the home, but just in of themselves, say, have a struggle with reading aloud, what would you tell that parent?
Yeah, you'll get better at reading aloud the more you do it. And probably if you're not used to reading aloud very much, even the sound of your own voice reading may be a little startling to you or uncomfortable. There's a few ways around this. One is just to stick with it, knowing that you'll get more used to it and you'll get better at it as time goes on. But another is to use audiobooks. I think sometimes we think those are cheating because it's not the parent reading aloud. But really, if we think about the goals of reading aloud, we want those grammatically correct, sophisticated language patterns in through the ear. That happens with an audiobook. And we want the shared experience of being, rooting for the same characters and experiencing the story together, right? That happens with an audiobook too. So even if it's not read in your voice, there are some amazing audiobook versions where they're read by actors or professional narrators that are so delightful to listen to. And in fact, one of the books my older kids and I are reading aloud right now, we're doing an audiobook because then I get to do the puzzle with them, which is fun. And it takes less of a commitment. So if you're feeling a little hesitant or tired, audiobooks can really come in and save the day.
Very good. Very good. Now, at your site, readaloudrevival.com, you speak of, and you've already touched on it with reading to all the children, but even when children are old enough to read on their own, why continue? You speak on that. Why do you really get into still reading to them aloud, even when they're able on their own?
Really, our kids are in the most danger of losing their love for stories and reading after they're able to read on their own. It's not when they're young, it's as they get older. And reading aloud can really keep that love of stories ignited. It also can be a really wonderful opportunity to have conversations with your kids about topics that might not come up any other way. Difficult things on the news or in culture, they can come up in stories, and it gives you kind of a safe, I guess, or more comfortable way of tackling those topics in a conversation. And then also remember that those grammatically correct, sophisticated language patterns are really only getting stored in our brain quite as accurately when they're coming in through the ear. And that remains true always. And so I think we tend to associate reading aloud with what you do with kids who aren't reading on their own yet. But if we see it for the tremendous good it can be on its own, just of its own accord, always, whether it's adults or teenagers or older kids who can read for themselves if they wanted to, it's a special gift that we can give them. And it also, especially right now, I think it sends a really clear message to our kids when we say, I'm willing to put aside the to-do list and all the things, all my responsibilities and things I've got weighing on my mind to just enjoy this story with you and be all the way here. Because you can't be somewhere else in your mind and reading aloud to your kids. It requires you to be really present, which is a tremendous gift, I think.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Sarah. I mean, this has been very informative. It gives me some food for thought as I'm, preparing for down the road. But listen, we appreciate you sharing on this Sharing Hope site. But for those that are listening, we've mentioned readaloudrevival.com. You mentioned the quiz link earlier. Is there any other ways where they can obtain resources or seek you out? Or is it just going to readaloudrevival.com or readaloudrevival.com?
Yeah, readaloudrevival.com is the best home base. But if you're a podcast listener, we have over 150 episodes up in podcast apps. Whatever one you use, we're probably there. And that is our favorite thing to do. And so every other week we have a new episode going up, and we talk to authors and parents, educational experts. Sometimes we just troubleshoot common frustrations or talk about books we're excited about. So check us out in whatever your favorite podcast app is. We're also on Instagram. It's a great place where sometimes I just pop up a favorite book recommendation or a tip from our community. And so that's another great place to check out.
Fantastic. Well, we will look to put some of those links on the site right here at Sharing Hope. In the meantime, to the viewer, thank you for joining us. We hope you got a lot out of this. I'm sure you did. And Sarah, again, thank you for imparting this knowledge, and we appreciate you, and continue. Keep up the good work.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm excited about this resource, excited for all the families who will get a little piece of hope here. So thanks for including me.
You bet. Thanks again.